Okay, so let's talk about creativity. Creativity isn't just about creating art pieces. Creativity is a way of thinking, an ability to think outside of the box. And usually, the more outside the box you're able to think, the more problems you're able to solve, and the more success you're gonna have in life. Creative. If you're not creative, you're not using your brain. Some people are not naturally more creative. It's not that. Everyone has creative capacity. Why? Because as children, if you notice children, they're really creative. And one of the things about children that's so fascinating is that they just have no filter. Um, they children who they children have children whose frontal cortex isn't as developed as adults often rely more on imaginative and sensory based thinking. So when you're a child, you have a completely different way of thinking. The way that children think is in images and sensations. For example, if I tell you, um, think about think about how a apple feels in your hand, right? Or think about how does the smell of oranges smell, right? Or think or imagine a chair from the bottom up, right? That's how children think. Children, for example, children who can't think, who can't use words because they're still not old enough, they think in this way, in sensations and images. And this type of thinking um, tends to be lost when you grow up. In fact, this type of thinking is usually what is required to discover a lot of scientific, like for example, like Einstein, he discovered the laws of relativity through thinking in imaginative ways, thinking in sensory way, where he wasn't just doing experiments, he was doing thought experiments, right? And this is pretty much the hallmark of every groundbreaking scientific discovery, thinking in images, and that's usually the way that children think, right? Adults tend to overuse their prefrontal cortex. We tend to over rely on our strongest trait, and this tends to decrease their capacity to be creative. In children, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision making, problem solving, and self control, is not fully developed, right? So they have low self control, and this they have really bad decision making. This impacts their thinking as they rely more on imagination and sensory experience to understand and interact with the world around them. On the other hand, adults have a more developed frontal cortex, which influences their logical reasoning and experience based decision making. But also, they tend to just rely too much on logical thinking. This plus this equals this, right? They they rely on it because it's more comfortable and because it just gives you more results quicker. Results, in reality, those results are pretty low quality. What will give you better results, for example, let me give you an example of this way of thinking. I asked myself, okay, let me think of the concept of love. What image represents the concept of love, right? So I just imagine what's the concept of love. I imagined falling in love is like a ladder, right? The more you climb it, the more you love someone. If you fall out of that ladder, the higher you are, the more it hurts, right? So that's an example, right? You're like, okay, let me just imagine that ladder. You imagine it, you're climbing up, and you're like, okay, that kind of does represent love, but what about when you love multiple people? How does can this ladder represent that love? And so you try to play it with those images. You say, okay, let me have two ladders. You're like, no, two ladders holding on to each other doesn't really make a good ladder because it doesn't have a stable support. So maybe that image does not represent love. Let me try to find another image to represent love or another metaphor to represent love. And then when you find that metaphor, you experiment with it. You see whether or not this metaphor follows the laws of physics in this imaginary world. An example of this, I had to write down a few because I feel like this is what I practice with a lot of these concepts that I teach you guys, but I couldn't come up with I couldn't come up with one come up with one out the blue. So let me give you guys one. The universe as a symphony. Imagine the fundamental forces of nature, gravity, electromagnetism, as different musical instruments playing together in harmony. Another thing is like Entropy as a messy room. Visualize the second law of thermodynamics as a room gradually becoming more disorganized and cluttered, right? And you could easily see how that works. And then you could play around with that image and say, okay, if I consciously go in there and clean the room, does that represent actual laws of entropy? Well, yes, right? Naturally, things go in one direction into chaos unless there's another force that comes in and tries to like reorder the chaos, right? Another way is gravity as a web. Imagine planets and stars connected by intricate web of gravitational threads. And so you could imagine, you can play with it. If something weighs a lot, if it weighs enough weight, the web, like ain't like even the laws of physics, the web will break and create a black hole, right? The same thing with the web, that it'll break and it'll just fall down. And no matter how much you play around with that metaphor, that gravity is as a web, you will notice that that metaphor will stay in line with the laws of physics. In line with the laws of physics, right? So you want to be able, if you have a concept, sometimes the best thing to think about that concept more deeply is to find a visual metaphor in your mind. Because if it's true, there's going to be a metaphor. If it's a true concept, so a metaphor that follows the laws of physics that I thought about, that was really good, and that I used to kind of think about these concepts is, because I wrote it down, is magnet and iron filling. If you pull away like a magnet, people will genuinely like you, like iron fillings will be drawn to you even more, sticking with you for a long time. But those who don't like you will only chase to satisfy their own ego and until they lose interest, much like how iron fillings lose their attraction to a magnet once it's removed. This metaphor illustrates how people's reaction to your distance reveal their true motivations and feelings towards you. So the metaphor, you have to think hard and think about a metaphor that sort of that follows genuine laws, right? It's almost like like the metaphor of gaining power, right? It's like climbing a mountain. Not a lot of people are gonna make it, and the only ones that can make it are those who have the capacity to gain power, right? And so, in like in life, most people will die as they go up, and only very few will reach there. And once they reach there, they'll notice that they're alone, and in reality, this power that they have is kind of isolating, right? And so these concepts allow you to think in deeper and more profound way and through multiple dimensions. And this genuinely takes effort. You have to sit down and genuinely want to get at the truth. And sit down and try to write down as many metaphors that fits this concept that you are trying to understand. And eventually, if it's a real thing, there's going to be a metaphor in nature that reflects that. Another example is imagining how justice is a balance beam, right? You'll notice that, or even the pyramid of health. What's that thing called? Of the hierarchy of needs. That pyramid represents is a very good visual representation of a concept of hierarchy, and how power, the one on top, is controlling everyone on the bottom. And usually the people on the bottom are the ones that have to take the most pressure. And the higher you get in the ranks, the less pressure you have, right? Or the more on top of that you are, the more easy it is to destroy you or isolate you. In fact, some countries used to routinely kill their kings to prevent a dictatorship. I think so, something like that. And so this, if you understand the concept, you're going to understand it more deeply and more dimensional if you find a visual representation or find multiple representations and literally play with it. You literally just play with it in your image. Like if you take away the bottom parts of the pyramids, you know what that means? That still means it's still, the guy's still on top. The guy still has people who's under him, right? And this playing around with the the image and removing parts, adding parts, and seeing how adjusting the image in your mind, how that kind of is a representation of your concept and whether or not they stay consistent. And let me give you an example of this, right? How the metaphor resilient and its metaphor in the world. A tree in the wind, just as a tree flexes and bends in the face of the strong wind, yet remains rooted and ultimately returns to its upright position. A resilient person in a system can weather challenges and setbacks, adapting and recovering to emerge stronger and more robust. This metaphor captures the idea that resilience is not about an immovable or rigid, but about flexibility, adaptability, and the ability to bounce back from adversity. In other words, creativity, right? And this visual image, you can play around with it. If this tree is isolated and not around other trees, it's weaker. Just like any person who is isolated and doesn't have the connection of the other trees nurturing it is alone, and it's going to wither away whenever there's a lot of problems. In fact, some animals, when there's a drought, the trees that are interconnected will literally start giving water to the tree and nutrients to the other trees that surrounding it that actually lacks it. It's the power of interconnection. But trees that are put in the cities, they're usually isolated because they're not born naturally, so they don't have that much support system, and a lot of them are generally have a weaker immune system than trees in the woods. It's a perfect metaphor. People living in cities. And how people in cities are not connected. There are people, but they're not truly connected. Their roots are not connected. So you can see how you can learn so much. You could go so deeply and have such a creative experience with playing around with finding images, finding metaphors for concepts that you have. And this is how physics, a lot of people in physics do this. Like if you see how they found out that things are in superstate, you'll notice that they used waves. I think I've wrote about this, how particles as waves. Picture a subatomic particle like an electron as a wave on an ocean with properties like frequency and amplitude. And then what they did, they said if this is a real metaphor, then this can really happen in we could really use this test to find things about physics. And I also notice how there's just so many metaphors for this, man. And sometimes if you truly understand a concept, find a visual metaphor and play around with it in your mind. Poke at it, find some holes in it, and you're just gonna look at it from a completely different perspective. So due to the less developed frontal cortex that children have, children often engage in imaginative and creative thinking, enabling them to perceive the world through a lens of curiosity, exploration, and creativity. The difference between that, though, is that they don't have the discipline and the logical and the rational brain to be able to take that and to create something worthy of to be admired, right? There's just a burst of energy with no direction. This imaginative thinking allows children to approach problems and situations with a sense of wonder and open-mindedness. Children often rely on sensory. So this sense of curiosity, exploration, and open-mindedness, the only thing it needs is some logical and rational ways of thinking. And if you allow that to happen and give it information, which means practicing something for a long time, becoming an expert into something, give someone with a skilled mind that has developed skills, give them the ability of children where they could think in sensory and in imaginative ways, and then give it discipline, which is in logical thinking, which is the adult type of thing. And there you pretty much have a genius. You have someone who is exceptionally creative and contributing to mankind. You have a pretty creative person, right? And so because children rely on sensory experiences to understand and interpret the world, their less developed prefrontal cortex contributes to a greater emphasis of sensory input, such as touch, sight, sound, and taste, which shapes their perception and understanding of the environment. And this is the foundation as to what makes the difference between the way an adult thinks and a child thinks. Both of them, each other's weakness is the other person's strength. The other person's strength is the other person's weakness. The goal as an adult is to revert back to a childlike state without losing the logical and rational mind of the adult. is to be able to think with more imagination and with more sensory experiences, and be able to be more curious about things and ask simple questions. If you direct that with a logical way of thinking, you pretty much have a very potent creative individual.